Is Ukraine driving the Russians back in Sumy? Just why Sumy? And more importantly, what does this mean for the state of the fearsome Russian army? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit that subscribe button, and of course, if you can, get access to those exclusive videos for members on combatvetnews.com. Link is in the description. Now, let's talk about Sumy Oblast. So, for those of you that have been living under a rock, you might recall that Ukraine staged last year a pretty major incursion into Kursk Oblast, pushing something like 40 miles at the apex into Russian sovereign territory. The fundamental idea was to have a bargaining chip in the event of peace negotiations with Russia, in which the Russians would have to trade considerably to get their territory back. Of course, the Russians, in turn, went to the North Koreans and said, listen, we need some extra troops for a little operation. And the North Koreans were happy to provide an additional 15,000 combatants and drove the Ukrainians out. And then Putin, in turn, invaded Sumy Oblast, an area where he has no real claim. And so now the Ukrainians have been launching their own counter-offensive into Sumy. And you can see here that it's actually achieved some localized effects, right? Notably, yesterday, you've got this village here of Andriivka has seen Ukrainian forces advance somewhat along this tree line here. Now, what's notable is that essentially, one, that this is not part of some kind of sweeping counteroffensive effort. Those just don't happen in this war, right? Drones and technology is such that we're never going to see that. It's not going to happen. And instead, what you have is the ability to find these localized areas where there is overhead cover in the form of foliage and overhead concealment in the form of foliage and cover in the form of thick trees, because FPV drones, just like they can't navigate through netting, dense foliage and trees and undergrowth can actually form effectively a net that FPV drones cannot penetrate. And so it seems like the Ukrainians are starting to sort of find some of these localized areas. You can see here where this tree cover allows them to conduct a limited level of advance and infiltration. Now, rolling back against the Russian armed forces, I mean, it probably could be considered good. I remain a skeptic of any Ukrainian offensive action for the simple reason that if their best chance for victory is inflicting casualties on the Russian armed forces, launching their own offensive operations allows Russia to pivot to the comparatively safe defense. And so, the question remains, is this kind of worth it? And obviously, I don't see the casualty numbers, and they're not going to be released by Ukraine or anyone, so it's difficult to really definitively say. And you can see here that the reporting is actually more generous for Ukraine by Live UA Map, which again is somewhat more cautious in terms of their willingness to stake out these small little swaths and strips of territory that are being fought over. This shows that the Russians really don't control more than the outskirts of Andriivka and Oleksiivka. But observe here, right? One of the core problems with this is that this is marshy lowland. And to me, I look at it and I go, listen, it's not clear what the Ukrainians are going to achieve by advancing up through this area. Again, I think what this probably is meant to be some kind of symbolic victory for Ukraine to sort of prove to the U.S. allies and to the Europeans that they are still in the fight. But these kind of symbolic victories are not victories at all. And ultimately, I think the whole sort of mentality, you can see here, Ukrainians also reportedly launching a small localized counteroffensive 11 hours ago that they have taken Mykolivka, Zeleny High, and Volodymyrivka villages in Donetsk. And this is part, again, of an effort kind of to reduce, some of this Russian offensive effort south of Pokrovsk. But I look at some of these things and, I'm just such a skeptic. And here's why. Because the Ukrainians, instead of launching these counteroffensive efforts, they've had a year to build new, improved defensive lines along some of these areas westward of their so-called fortress belt. They say, oh, there's 10 years of defensive lines, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think you have, those defensive lines in the previous era were built for an older war. And I think given the fact that the Russians are likely still weeks at best, possibly months away from taking Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians should be focusing this time on building new defensive lines, right? Constructing new routes to resupply forces, building new defensive positions that will be very difficult for the Russians to find and destroy. There's a lot of opportunities here, I think, to make the Russians pay that massive, massive price for continued offensive actions. And so I'm skeptical when I see the Ukrainians launch these sort of offensive actions. As good as it feels emotionally to see Russia get rolled back, as good as it probably looks politically, ultimately, symbolic victories don't win wars. Battlefield victories win wars. And for the Ukrainians, the battlefield victory has to come from killing Russians en masse. And so the question is that going to achieve the political effects that Ukraine needs it to? And that's a conversation for another time. But what I think, again, if you take anything away from this, please understand that this was likely chances are for the Ukrainians, this was part of a very systematic, careful effort to essentially clear out these individual Russian positions, likely using primarily FPV drones and even ground strike drones, finding these Russian positions, clearing them out with drones, and then having infantry advance, occupy the positions, and dig in again. And again, when you have these narrow forest strips, the fighting within them is extremely intense. And honestly, this sort of super clear line itself, as we've talked about, the gray zone, the no man's land in the Ukrainian front lines is closer to 10 kilometers, right? Thanks to the profusion of FPV drones across the front lines. And, when you have this sort of thing, like, what does it mean to advance within the gray zone, right? To me, I look and I say, hey, it's like in World War I. If you're saying, listen, we advanced, 300 meters into this place or that place. Well, what exactly would you say that those people have achieved, right? You can see here, this is 1,200 meters. If you were to say in World War I, hey, we advanced 1,200 meters today, you'd go, well, that's barely through no man's land. Like, did you even advance crossing through a designated no man's land to get to the other side? Like, that's not an advance. You've crossed uncontested territory. And again, I'm not somebody, you guys know, I'm not somebody who's like anti-Ukrainian by any stretch of the imagination. I'm anti-bad tactical decisions, and I'm anti-symbolic political victories taking the place of actual battlefield victories. And again, war is politics, but Ukraine's allies know the score. They don't need a symbolic victory to know whether they should support them or not. And the Russian public is never going to hear about these kind of victories because the Russian public doesn't have free and fair flow of information. So who's this for? Who are we trying to tell here, right? The United States, right? We have the CIA. I mean, we don't listen to them. At least the White House doesn't listen to them. But, some people do. And, some people in government do. And the people that don't listen to them are never going to hear about this anyway. So, again, shout out to the Ukrainians. But boy, I just wish I would see them focus first and foremost on inflicting Russian casualties and damaging the Russian economy. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe button. Thanks to our Colonel tier members, Officer Merle, Deborah Oppenheimer, Paul JW, Jeff Javies, Mike 54, Stream Margaret, GMAC Club, all of our Lieutenant tier members. Again, couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate you so much. Cheers.